Tilea's Troubles, Part 38. Morr helps those who help themselves. Remas, outside the Palazzo Montini, residence of the Arch-Lector of Morr. Spring, 2402. Father Gonsalvo was alive. Like everyone else, Biagino had believed Gonsalvo was cut down with the Viadazan swordsman during the Battle of Pontramola. Gonsalvo had been at the fore in the thickest of the fighting, yet when he was wounded he was not killed, and had lain unconscious amongst the corpses at the river's edge. The blood and mud meant he was unrecognised the next day, when he was taken away with the worst of the casualties in waggons to Rapallo. Having barely regained his wits, and being only just able to walk when the undead arose throughout the realm of Viadazza, he fled with a farmer's family to Scorsio, remaining there until he recovered fully, both body and mind, from his ordeal. He was, however, not quite the same man as previously. He had become so utterly obsessed with fighting the undead armies of the north that he had no conversation, nary a thought in his head that did not pertain directly to that cause. He had become the very quintessence of a holy warrior. Which is why, perhaps, that it was Gonsalvo, and not Biagino, who stood beside no less than the Morrite Lector of Viadazza, Bernardo Ugolini, and the Arch-Lector of Morr, Callictus II himself. While these high clergymen watched the military parade in the street, Father Gonsalvo raised his hand to bless each passing company of soldiers. The Reman Captain-General, Duke Scaringella, led the parade upon his colourfully barded horse, dipping his lance as he passed by the Arch-Lector's Palazzo and the gathered clergy. Behind him came several palace guards, including an ensign carrying the colours, 2 drummers, and 4 sword-bearing sergeants. Other palace guards stood behind the Arch-Lector and other clergy, while a halberdier company stood in order to his left. The Arch-Lector himself was immediately flanked by Lector Bernardo and Captain Soldatovia, the mustachioed Kislevite commander of the palace guards, while a priestly secretary stood a little behind in case His Holiness needed him for anything. Father Gonsalvo had saved his most impressive and powerful prayer for the great engine of war which was the focus of the procession. Designed and built by the famous polymathic genius Angelo da Leone, it was a mighty contraption of iron and timber intended to smash the undead legions, with both its own bodily weight and that of the lead and iron shot it could bring to bear. Buried inside its sturdy timber hull was a steam-powered engine, its clanking, grinding, red-hot heart fed coal by 2 sweating crewmen. Aloft was an iron-armoured platform, mounting an impressive artillery piece of 9 barrels and several more brass patereros besides, about which the liveried gunners busied themselves to fire occasional shotless salutes for the encouragement of the crowds. Da Leone himself, like the master of a ship, was directing his invention, dressed as the other crewmen in Reman livery, honoured to be joined by the Arch-Lector's own standard-bearer, whose crossed keys flag fluttered from the rear as they trundled along the wide street. The genius was deep in thought, listening to every croak and rumble from the engine below, occasionally breaking from his reverie to shout correctional instructions down through the peepholes drilled through the upper platform's base to allow communication with those labouring down in the darkness and steam of the lower deck. The engine was an important part of the Arch-Lector's army. Everyone knew that the priests of Morr were dedicated to thwarting the undead, and served a god who hated the undead more than any other, either deity or mortal. In battle, their magically potent prayers could gift soldiers with a portion of Morr's hatred, so that they fought all the more bravely. Yet it was commonly held that Morr helps those who help themselves, more warmly welcoming such people into his heavenly garden in the afterlife. The city had indeed done so, raising a great sum of money to pay for this modern, monstrous machine of metal and oak, the result of a brilliant mind, ingenious craftsmanship, and hard, skilled labour. Just ahead of the engine strode another priest of Morr, repeatedly chanting the words of a blessing not dissimilar to Father Gonsalvo's. Rarely, even in the city of gods, had so many prayers and blessings been poured upon something other than a mortal soul. It was as if the engine were being transformed into a carroccio, not by loading it with holy relics, but by washing it with prayers for hours on end. In contrast to the constant, priestly intonations, the vigorous beating of the drums, and the steaming judders of the steam-powered workings, the watching crowd fell silent as the engine passed by. Although the citizens had cheered every company of soldiers as they came into sight, the monstrous, horseless engine was so strange to their eyes that their voices invariably petered out in awe. This was not magic, nor illusion, but an ingenious, artificial construct so heavy that it ground up the road, and so well armed that it must surely prevail against the enemy. It had been a topic of conversation at every inn, tippling house and tavern in the city, and so many hopes were pinned upon it that it could do no other than draw everyone's eyes. Behind the engine marched an impressive mercenary pike regiment, their pike shafts painted near the tips with the colours of Remas, while many of the other soldiers sported at least some clothing in the blue and red of Remas. But neither the crowd or the clergy were much impressed by the pikes, not having witnessed the might of the engine moments before, and still with the brimstone-tainted, smoky steam lingering in their noses and upon their tongues. Now, at last, thought many in the crowd, Remas is ready to go to war. Tilea's Troubles, Part 38, continued. Lodging and Victuals. Camprenefro, south of Raverno. "There's nothing here for us, nothing of worth, anyway," complained Pasquale for the third time that hour, his voice loud enough so that those riding behind him, yet upwind, could hear. Tino answered, not bothering to turn in his saddle to look. "You knew that, Pas, before we set off. We're not here to loot." "Never mind looting. There's not even food or shelter. Fields all barren, cattle stolen, and what few folk we found in a bad way in a worse mood. We may as well be in a desert." They had ridden for 3 days now, one of several companies of Portomaggiore horsemen scouring different parts of the region, each assigned certain roads, villages or valleys, while some patrolled the forest edge at the southern border. The VMC's army had done a thorough job of sacking the whole area. It seemed northerners were no less adept at plundering than even the most veteran of Tilean mercenaries. Now all that remained were the ragged survivors and scattered bands of brigands, bolstered in numbers by the desperate and the dispossessed. Tino carried a brace of long-barrelled pistols in holsters upon either side of his saddle, and wore sufficient plates of armour to protect his torso and his upper legs, his lower legs enclosed in thick leather boots. His hat was a scrumpled but liveried affair, unlike his friend Pasquale's, which was much larger and made more enormous by the huge panache feathers attached to it. This was not vainglory, however, for Pasquale was the company's hornblower, and in battle it helped if his fellows could locate him with their eyes also when they needed to rally, for a galloping rider might not always find the breath to sound a particularly loud note. Tino gently slowed his mount's pace until he was riding beside his irritable comrade. "You're looking at it wrong. You should be glad that the northerners came to Tilea, for if they hadn't fought Kernagswag, then I reckon it would have been us who had to do it." "Tino, I'll tell you what I'm looking at. This place," countered Pasquale. "I'm looking at what the northerners did. They may be heroes for fighting against the Wag, but then they did this, turning honest farmers into beggars and robbers." Aye, they did. But I say again, you're still not seeing it right. Why not be glad the northerners attacked here instead of Portomaggiore?" "Oh, I'm ecstatic about it. I suppose next you'll be telling me that I ought to be happy I don't have to carry all the loot they took, and that the wine they stole would have given me a headache in the morning, and that—" "Hush now," interrupted Tino, pointing ahead. "No shelter, you said? Look up there. That sure looks like shelter to me." It was a dwelling of modest size, which on first sight appeared as ruinous as nearly every other they had seen, but upon closer inspection was undergoing repairs, if in a haphazard and makeshift sort of way. The original roof was gone, replaced by a tangle of broken timbers supporting a stiff canvas sheet. Faces peered from behind the walls. Tino turned away from the company's line of passage to ride towards the dwelling. 3 others, including Pasquale, followed him. The rest of the riders apparently did not share Tino's curiosity and carried on with their own course, no doubt tired of this miserable land and its miserable and meagre pickings. Besides, the room was too small for all of them, so they probably knew they would have to find somewhere else for the night. As Tino drew up, he saw that the 3 inhabitants were everything he had come to expect from this land. An old bent man leaning heavily on a stick, a battered and bruised peasant with his arm in a sling, and a woman carrying nothing more exciting than a bundle of sticks. "You there!" shouted Tino, having unholstered his long horseman's pistol, a habit formed from bitter experience with brigands over the last few days. "Is this place yours?"
"What's left of it, aye," said the injured man in a thick Raverno accent. "All ours. Why, are you intending to smash it up some more?"
Pasquale laughed. "There's not much left to smash, my friend." "You needn't fear us," reassured Tino. "We're here to make things better, not worse. Stupid question, I know, but who did this?"
"Foreigners, of the ultramontane kind," said the old man in a croaky voice.
Tino asked the question he'd been using a lot recently. "Why?" Now the old man gave vent to a bitter laugh.
"Because this is what soldiers do. I know, I was one once."
"No, old man. I mean, why here, not somewhere else? Why attack Campanefro?"
They said we were being punished," said the man with an arm in a sling. "I told them we hadn't done anything to them. This is what I got."
He held up his injured arm. Tino frowned. This was new. Punished for what?
"I don't know," said the wounded man. "Having hens? Being close by?"
The old man coughed, and everyone looked at him.
"They said that this will teach you not to throw Marienburgers out of windows."
Pasquale swept his hand as if to indicate all around. "Seems a bit too much punishment for a spot of tomfoolery and rough and tumble," he said.
"That was their excuse," said the old man, "not their real purpose. When I was a soldier, we found fighting greenskins to be a very unprofitable affair. The sort of things they treasured weren't exactly what we wanted to loot. I reckon the Ultramontanes came here because they needed pay and plucked at any excuse to make their robberies seem like something more respectable."
"You can tell us about your adventures over supper, old man," said Tino, smiling. "In the meantime, wench," he said, fixing his eyes on the woman with the faggot, "how about using your burden to get a fire burning? Oh, and what have you got to eat?"